So for those of you who are just joining us, welcome, and I invite you to share your name, where you're located geographically, and what brings you to the conversation tonight. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Folks, some friends may still be joining us, but thank you for joining us tonight and taking some time out of I know your busy schedules. Summer can be a very busy time for both rest and fun and so forth. So thank you for taking time out. If you're just joining us, please share your name in the chat, where you're located, and sort of what brings you to this conversation. I'm really honored to be here tonight and to facilitate this conversation. My name is Tron Kim Sr., and I'm a proud member of Fairlington Presbyterian Church, who is organizing and hosting this event tonight. And I will introduce some other folks as we go along. So thank you again for coming tonight and for joining us for what I hope will be a brave and illuminating conversation on race, social justice, family, and faith through the lens of an incredible activist and human being, John Henry Scott, whose life story was told with the help of his daughter, Cleo Brown, in the book Witness to the Truth, My Struggle for Human Rights in Louisiana. Where's my copy to show you all? This is the book. So if you're able to get it from your local bookstore, locally owned bookstore, we would encourage that. If you can't find it because it was printed in 2003, you can find it on Amazon as a last resort if you must. Before we proceed much further, though, I'd like to pause for a moment and turn the mic over to Pastor Julie, who is the head pastor of Fairlington Presbyterian Church, to offer us a centering prayer, as faith was a very important part of Reverend Scott's life. So Julie, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Tron. So I have also been working my way through the Witness to the Truth, and I have found it to be a fascinating story, an incredible narrative that Cleo Scott Brown has put together using interviews that her father gave before he died. And he also left some words for his children toward the end of his life in the last chapter of the book. And I'd like to share some of these words with you now, and then offer a prayer in the same spirit that he offers these words about his struggle to win the right to vote for the African Americans of Lake Providence. As I look back and reminisce about those dark years when we groped our way, I am reminded of what the great prophet Jeremiah said: "Walking with God in the dark, still you are not walking alone. Your God can show you the way." So we walked across the years on God's strength until we finally came into the light. Not because we could see the light in the distance, not because we had a path laid out to follow, not because someone had given us an instruction book. We were able to walk because we believed in someone greater than mankind. I walked because God had made me know that one person could make a difference in a town, a state, or a country when that person could see possibilities out of impossibilities. Let us pray. Lord, as we gather this evening, we ask that you would help us to become the kind of people who can make a difference in our town, our state, our country. People who see possibilities out of impossibilities. For you are the God who makes a way where there is no way. This evening, help us to be inspired and motivated to be the people of hope and change and love that this world so needs. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Jacob, you were there. Sing that for the first time. I could hear.
Amen. Thank you. I hope that one of the reasons that you're here today is because you're invested in the work of racial justice. When it comes to racial justice, America as a nation has much to atone for, which means that we have much to do because reconciliation does not happen without all of us rolling up our sleeves and using whatever resources and means we have to act. Reverend Scott was someone who embodied that call to action. And his story provides us with an invaluable roadmap for continuing the fight for human rights. Born in 1901, Reverend Scott grew up in Lake Providence, Louisiana, a majority Black town where Black businesses, schools, and neighborhoods thrived in isolation from whites. Yet from Reconstruction until the 1960s, no Blacks had been allowed to vote. Scott, a minister and farmer, eventually convinced Attorney General Robert Kennedy to participate in his crusade to win the right to vote, leading a 25-year struggle that illustrates how persistent efforts by local citizens translated into a national movement and helped impact voting rights. His story is told in the book Witness to the Truth, which his daughter, Cleo Scott Brown, writes, which I hope you will go out and buy. It may be hard to come by because it was published in 2003, but like I said, it is available on Amazon. Hold without bitterness or anger, in Reverend Scott's own words, Witness to the Truth chronicles almost 100 years of life in the rural South, including grandparents' recollections of slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, and his own recollections of sharecropping, northern migrations, the displacement of Black farmers during the New Deal, and the methods white Southerners used to keep African Americans under economic domination and away from the polls. It clearly illustrates the complexities of Southern race relations and the important lessons the country can learn from its history and from the raw courage of small town unsung heroes. While I have the privilege of facilitating tonight's conversation, I cannot take credit for discovering Cleo and for discovering the story and Cleo. That credit goes to my partner, Norman Kim Sr., who will introduce Cleo and talk about why this particular story is so important and worthwhile. Before I turn the mic over to Norman, I want to name that the conversation tonight may make you feel uncomfortable or may surface emotions for you at times. And I encourage you to take care of yourself as you feel the need to. I also hope that you won't pull away completely and that you choose to stay in this conversation with us, despite whatever may come up. We'll take a short break after my conversation with Cleo to give you a chance to use the bathroom, to hydrate, whatever you need to do. So do know that that break is built into the schedule. And with that, I would like to turn over the mic to Norman to introduce Cleo.
Thanks, Strawn, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I just have a few thoughts that I put together so that before you get to hear the main event, which I know will be an exciting conversation. So here we go. In the face of great personal injustice and offense, I think that vengeance is almost a universal response. This drive is even more powerful when our families and others whom we love are unjustly attacked and systematically persecuted for simply claiming the dignity that every human deserves. Cleo Scott Brown and her extended family know this space of persecution with minute intimacy. To me, it sounds hard to grow up with family members being run out of town, family friends being run out of town, the sheriff threatening to arrest your mother, white neighbors taking shots at your family, and Black neighbors believing that you are exposing the Black community to too much danger. As I read her book, Witness to the Truth, I discovered many moments and events that should have hardened Cleo's heart and snuffed out her joy. For me, the persecution that was inflicted on Cleo and her family is enough for at least 2 lifetimes of justifiable rage. And yet, Cleo has chosen a different path. Not only is she a successful writer, speaker, and educator, she has also had a successful corporate career. She's a mother, a successful wife, a strong woman, a powerful woman. And I call the difference there between strong and power, because with power, you take the onus and the drive and the initiative to help shape your reality, which is exactly what this woman is doing. You're about to meet a woman who has a magical ability to carry the heavy stories of hurt, betrayal, and cruelty inflicted on her family by a white political elite of Lake Providence in Louisiana, her hometown, and the US government in general, and still approach that same community with love, with hope, with joy, with creativity. I find her to be a funny, warm, insightful, direct, and wise person. So it is my honor to introduce you to this extraordinary person, and I look forward to the next conversation that follows.
Yay! Round of applause. Feel free to use your emojis. All right. So just to give you all folks a sense of the rhythm of the evening, in case you forgot in the email. After the break, we'll get a chance to connect with George Foote, who's a good friend of Cleo's and whose family was also involved in the campaign, in the fight for voting rights, but sort of on the opposite side. So we'll hear his story, and then we'll have a chance to chat with the both of them and learn about their friendship and sort of what we might gain from that friendship. So Cleo, welcome to the spotlight. So as Norman said, you have had a background in business and in risk management. So very, very different work than writing a book. So what sort of compelled you to first share this story about your family? What moved you to do that, and when did that process start for you?
Okay, let me start by saying good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Extending a special thank you to Reverend Wilson Blackford and the Fairlington Presbyterian Church for giving me this opportunity. And also to Norman, who kind of discovered me and introduced me to the church. But so I appreciate this wonderful opportunity and the chance to work with Norman and with Tron, both of you all. So back to your question, which is, well, I was working as a risk manager for a utility. And after my father passed, my sister was clearing out the house, and he had so many historical documents, so much paperwork there. And she's like, what am I gonna do with this? And, I'm like, I want it. So I drove to Louisiana, got the boxes of papers, documents, books, and brought it back to Charleston, South Carolina, where I live, and stuck it under the bed. And did nothing with it for a long time. And then I pulled it out one day, and I'm like, I don't believe this. I'm looking at stacks of typed sheets of paper, interviews done with my dad from Dr. Logston from the University of New Orleans. And it's just, the questions are all over the place. And I'm like, he talks about everything from slavery forward. And I sat down, and like 5 o'clock in the morning, I finished reading all these papers, and I'm like, this has to be turned into a book, because this explains why Black people do what they do and why white people do what they do. I'm like, I've never seen anything that made so much sense to me that took history. And like I said, he talked in no particular order. He was all over the place, but it was so much wisdom just in the notes that I'm like, this has to be turned into a book. And so then it's like, well, who's going to do it? And then it's like, well, I'm going to try, So that is how I started that journey toward becoming an author, and discovered that I was able to do it and do it, well enough for it to get us some awards and things like that. So
That's amazing. I mean, what a treasure trove, right? What a treasure trove. So I don't want to spend too much time in terms of the nitty gritty and the process of you writing the book, but I am curious sort of what was your process for organizing all of your father's thoughts and writings and sort of organizing it into this story that as Pastor Wilson said, is incredibly compelling and also very accessible to read.
Well, I started this probably before like a lot of super electronic stuff, but I made a copy of all the papers, and then I took folders and I put slavery or Civil War or, the 1930s, the Depression, all the different topics had a different folder. Then I chopped it up because you might have multiple topics on one sheet of paper, and I just cut it and put it in the folder. And then I put the folders in chronological order of when, that period in history, and was able to, for the most part, create a chapter around, if there was enough material, I was able to create a chapter around it. So that's basically how I did it. And then the story was, I was thinking, oh, some of this stuff seems so far-fetched. So then I started the fact checking. Can I trace everything my dad said to an independent document? And so then that's where it took me in the next 7 years into archives, court records, history books, research before you could just Google it. So that's how it all came together, and just it, and putting it in. He was telling it from his perspective, so to put it in dialogue and that kind of thing, to make it an easy read, like he's just telling you a story.
And that's mind-blowing. 7 years of research into this. That's my longest tenure at a workplace, 7 years. So that's a lot of time in my head.
Well, I was working lots of overtime, so I didn't have time to work on it every day.
Right. So can you talk about the landscape of voting rights for African Americans in the US and in the Lake Providence area during your father's time? Why was this such an important issue for him?
Okay. Well, in the place where we lived in the northeast corner of Louisiana, and those parishes along the Mississippi River, the Louisiana Delta, they were all majority Black, at least 75% Black, those parishes right together. And so I guess there was an even greater incentive to control Black voters, because that could have been such a block. And that was before, all this gerrymandering, when they had computer models so they can draw around and around, the parishes kind of went together for a district. And that would have been most likely a surefire, maybe Black senator or Black, person in the House of Representatives, whatever. So in the 1880s, during coming toward the end of Reconstruction, there were quite a few Black people on the city council. And so they were held up, city council was held up at gunpoint, and all the Black councilmen were forced to resign and signed a document saying that they were incompetent to do their duties that they sent to the governor. And so from the 1880s to the 1960s, no Black people were allowed to vote. And so that wasn't just in Lake Providence. In the 1958, the White Citizens Council did this campaign in Louisiana that basically removed every Black person from the entire state from the rolls, except I think it was a couple of thousand people that didn't get removed in 1 year's time. And so President Eisenhower decided to do civil rights, some type of hearings to try to find out why so few Black people were registered to vote in the South. And so that's how my daddy came into that. He wrote and asked if he could testify at one of these hearings. And so by the time the hearings actually came, then Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General, and he was able to make contact with him. So at the time, yes, hardly any Black people in the South could vote. So fortunately, my dad, because of going to the hearing, the hearing from the Justice Department, he got kind of moved up. Lake Providence got moved up. And so we were one of the first federal voting cases. And because of the things that happened in Lake Providence, they actually added, Robert Kennedy decided to add a lot more staff members to deal with voting rights because of what was done to one of the big farmers in retaliation for trying to get the right to vote.
Can you just?
I know that was a long answer.
No, not at all. Can you just recount like all the different hurdles? I mean, your dad was at this for a very long time. Before he got to the point of getting time with sort of on a national level and for the hearings to happen. Mm-hmm. But prior to that, I mean, there were so many different challenges and hurdles, and I'd love for you to talk about like all the different things, every time they went to the registrar's office, and every single time they would go, there would be some kind of excuse, some reason why they couldn't vote. They would sort of figure it out, handle the reason, right? Come back, and there was sort of something else would come up. So I'd love for you to share some of those things that would come up, that would sort of be made up, literally at times, to keep folks from voting.
Well, when he first started, nobody knew, no Black people knew where the registrar's office was. So that was the first hurdle of even finding out where you could register to vote. And once they finally figured out where that hidden office was, then they had to learn how to apply. And so if you applied, you had to calculate exactly how many days old you were. You were this number of years, this number of months, and this number of years. And if you were off one day, then you were disqualified. But the main thing in Lake Providence was that they said you had to get somebody to identify you, and it had to be somebody who was already registered to vote. And since you could never get the first white person to identify the first Black person, then no Black people could ever register to vote. And so the problem is that at that time, before the Voting Rights Act, every little town, every state, you create whatever voting rules you want. And your only recourse was to file a lawsuit. And so there is not that much money in the whole world to file a lawsuit in every jurisdiction in the South. And so it was like whack-a-mole. When you try to deal with one, that another one will pop up and another one pop up. So that's that's what it looked like before the Voting Rights Act. And so every little town had a different rule. So then they had to pass a test. There were 10 different versions. So they would teach everybody how, well, that was after the federal courts had made them start registering Black people. It was 10 different versions, and they would come down to the Baptist Center building where they would learn the answers to all these civic questions. It was like a civic exam, you know, a government exam. And then everywhere they would set up a class where people would learn how to pass the test, they would burn it down. So they burned, you know, one church got burned down 2 times after it was rebuilt. Then they burned it again. The Baptist Association building right next door to our house was burned. And so there were a lot of obstacles because whatever way you figured out, they would make another rule that would keep you from voting. So that's kind of where we are now since the Voting Act has been gutted again. So it's been gutted.
It almost feels like deja vu in a sense. During the hearings or the final hearings where your father finally gets the chance to register and vote, he's at there's a part in the book, and he's asked by one of the officials, or why is this so important to him? Why does he want to vote? Why does this matter so much to him? And I thought that excerpt in the book was really powerful, and I'm wondering if you could share that with us and read that part on page 160.
Okay. All right. She wanted me to share with you at the hearing in New Orleans before the Civil Rights Commission, and the Mr. Story, who was the chairman, the vice chairman, asked Daddy, why do you want to register to vote? And Daddy said, this was one question I could easily answer because I had spent so much time thinking about it. With all the conviction I felt, I said, I have always felt like that it was a responsibility that belonged to the citizens. After reading Louisiana history and the Constitution of Louisiana in the United States, it says that the right to vote belongs to the citizens. And I noticed it always gives recognition. I noticed the streets where people voted were fixed. I noticed the roads were graveled where people who voted lived, and the people who didn't vote had dirt roads. I noticed that the officers of the law respected the people who voted and treated them differently from the people who didn't vote. And after reading Negro newspapers and traveling quite a bit, I felt like it was a responsibility. After my 2 brothers served in the Army in World War II, and even before then during World War I, when the president was talking about making the world safe for democracy, and everybody had the right and privilege to participate, it had always been a burning zeal and desire within my heart to vote. I have to fight for this because I will never be able to explain to my children why the Negroes should be treated in such a way and be cast about.
Thank you. Your father and family, as Norman outlined, faced incredible challenges, and your father almost paid the ultimate price on 2 occasions. And there are plenty of times where, you know, as I read the book, like I would not have blamed him for giving up. And those who hopefully will read the book, I'm sure that you'll also feel the same way. Can you talk to us about sort of why, so what kept him going? What gave him the strength to continue to persist and to keep fighting in the face of so many challenges of safety issues for himself, for your family? Sort of what kept him going?
Well, I would say other than his family and trying to ensure that there was a better future for his children, which I see two are on this call tonight, a better chance, a better opportunity, a safer future for his children, but also what kept him going and fighting was his faith, because I think a lot of people don't think, like in my age group, you 60 and above people, we came along at the end of Jim Crow, and we grew up basically at a time when like white man went to war to preserve all the guarantees, everything that all the things that they had been guaranteed without competition, jobs, slots in schools, all kinds of things that they were guaranteed by the Jim Crow system. And when that battle began in the 50s, it was deadly. It was cruel. It was dangerous. People were getting killed. People be running, stop by the house, daddy, give them money so they can run on from Mississippi or whatever, running north. This is in our lifetime. And so when you think about the dangers, all the Black leaders that were being murdered in that, I'd say from 55 to 65, it was not the time for the faint at heart. And so I feel like if daddy didn't know God on such a personal level, that you would not be able to stand, you would not be able to keep fighting at something that took you 25 years to do. You would have been discouraged. You would have been afraid for your children and yourself. And of course, I think the children, my older siblings, they were kind of bold like him. And so they'd be pushing him up. No, don't leave. So I said that it was because not just that he knew God, but God knew him. And he and God seemed to be on real first name basis. And so even though I would be scared and I would lay in my bed at night and I would be listening, because we didn't have air conditioning, you have the windows up and you're listening to the crickets and then you hear a car coming down that gravel road and you hear the crunch of that gravel and you're thinking, we might die tonight. But then, if daddy was around, it's like you weren't scared, because in my little mind, my younger mind, it just felt like he and daddy so tight, we're gonna be all right. we'll be okay. But if he went out of town, or if he wasn't at the house, I didn't feel that same level of safety. Though, early on, right after he got shot, whenever he would go out of town, he would always have young adults to come and guard the house at night, to keep us safe. But, nothing's like daddy being there.
Yeah. So we in the story, we sort of get everything from your dad's point of view. We don't really get to spend much time with your mom and with you and your siblings. So I'm curious, sort of, how are you all processing everything that was going on? What were the conversations that you and your siblings had, that you and your mother had? We aren't really privy to that in the book. And how did you respond? What was going through your minds emotionally? What was happening behind sort of the scene, behind the doors in your home?
Well, I don't really recall us as children talking about, I'm talking about the younger ones, talking about what was happening. But like my sister who's on the call, who's from DC, Dr. Elsie Scott, she was older, and I think she had gone to, she may have to chime in, but I think she had gone to college the year that, or soon after Daddy got shot. So, but I remember her like being at the house one night when they called and they told my, she answered the phone and they told her, to tell your daddy, that he'd better be out of town by in the morning. And if they were coming, and if we weren't gone, they were going to rape my mother and they were going to kill my daddy. And I remember as a kid, 8 years younger than her, and her telling them, well, you better come ready because my daddy will be ready for you. And so it's like having older siblings who seem tough like daddy made me have to like not be such a fraidy cat and be strong. But I don't, we didn't really talk about it, but here they are, older siblings, and my mom has designated, like, if Daddy and I get killed, you are responsible for, because if there were 8 of us, you're responsible for that child, that child, that child. You're the oldest over here. You're responsible for that child, that child, that child. So those kinds of discussions are not the kinds of discussions that most people would ever have grown up with, talking about what to do if all of us get killed. I mean, all the parents get killed. But I think that the way that Daddy approached things made us bolder, and most of us are involved in work that has impact on the community. I think my middle sister probably was impacted negatively the most, because when we were in the car when Daddy got shot, she would have been the oldest child in the car. And also she was the one that was taken by the police into the sheriff's department without legal counsel, without parents, and they were telling her that if she didn't lie and say that Daddy was messing around with somebody, some woman in town, that they were going to send her to reform school, which is the same thing as juvenile detention now. And I just think that it just had a different impact on her because she was old enough to really understand what was going on.
For sure, for sure. Did you ever wish, looking back, do you ever wish that your dad shared more with you? And I know in the story, your mother and your father were of somewhat two differing minds about that. She was more of the mindset, of the frame of mind to sort of tell you all exactly what was going on, and sort of when it got to a certain point of danger, she felt the need to be upfront. And your dad was not necessarily there yet. He didn't want to scare you all. He didn't want you all to be afraid and so forth. Looking back, do you wish that he had shared more or not?
I thought about things like that, but I think the thing that I wish that he had shared more with me personally about was his spiritual walk, like when he would sit in a dark room for hours, if I had learned earlier, before I made mistakes in life, if I had learned more about the value of quiet time with the Lord and listening for direction and hearing his voice. And I think I would have liked to have had more conversations about that.
Mm, mhm. So was it through reading his, I guess is his journal, for lack of a better way to put it, was it then that you sort of became more aware of your dad's connection with God and his personal relationship with him?
No, I won't say that. I would say that, I mean, I was always aware of that connection. I just wasn't, it was like I was never told, you need to sit still and just just be quiet and listen, just that part. But no, I always sensed or knew that connection was there for him.
Mm, mhm, mhm. You weren't invited to the conversation. That was very personal.
Yeah, and I think I do wish I had asked him more about growing up with people born in the 1840s. Like, what was that like? And so people act, when I was looking at it, I'm like, people act like slavery was so long ago. The people who raised my daddy, who taught him how to be a man, were born in the 1840s. I'm like, so it can't be that far, you know. Of course, my daddy had me really late in life, but but it does, it makes you have that connection kind of straight back.
Yeah, yeah. And talking about education, your dad was a fervent believer in the power of education. He was unusually really well educated for his time and for his circumstance. Sort of, can you talk about that and sort of how did he gain access to such a high level of education? And what are your thoughts about education today, sort of as being, your dad really saw education as a source for lifting oneself up, for gaining respect, for finding a better way of life, and so on. Do you have the same faith in education today?
So I think you got to ask two questions: daddy's education. So living in an area around seniors and growing up in a community mostly of people who had lived in slavery times, they were extremely organized. Like if you look in the 1880s, 1870, 1880, 1890 papers for East Carroll Parish, you will see all the work that they were doing to put together a school and all the money that they had collected. So the land, the 60 acres of land on which I grew up, was land that was bought by them in 1906. And they started that school there, and people came in from other parishes so that Black children could be educated before the state decided to offer public education. So it was always a focus of the citizens of the newly freed out of East Carroll Parish. And so for daddy, they added grades and added grades and added grades, and then he eventually got his bachelor's in theology. So yes, education was very important to him because he grew up in a community where education was highly valued. And so as far as for me, you asked me about education and education today. It makes me, education today, and after I retired, I worked 5 years in and out of the school system. And I was disappointed at some of the things that I saw, but it almost felt like something that I had experienced when they decided to do freedom of choice, and your parents could sign you up to go to the white school. And I went there in the 8th grade. And I always said that going to integrated school was the most traumatic thing that I've ever done in my life. It was much more traumatic than being in the car with my daddy when he got shot. And but I kept asking myself, why was this the most traumatic experience? And I mean, I wrestled with this because I was blogging, and I kept trying to write an essay on it, and I couldn't get it done. And finally, 2 years ago, I wrote this piece called What White Teachers Taught Me About Race. And I was finally able to identify why it was the most traumatic thing. And that was because I was taught almost, I use the word almost, I was almost taught that who I was would never be enough. I was second top grade point average in my class. They wouldn't allow me in the honor society because a teacher had to recommend you, and nobody would recommend me. And it was like, you do your work. They give you, at the old school, the Black school, they give you the leftover books, they give you the leftover equipment, the leftover desk, and you come over to their school, and you compete at their level, and you beat almost all of them at their level, and then you're still treated like it's not enough, like your credentials don't equal those credentials because, and you keep saying because, and then you come to this conclusion that it's only because of the color of your skin. And then you're asking like why, like I never felt like, is my hair long enough? Are my clothes nice enough? Yeah. I never, ever thought about those things until I went to that school. And when I went back to work, like after I retired, working in the school system, and I'm seeing, you have like a 70% white teacher population ratio, and seeing some of the same kinds of environments where Black children never see anybody who looks like them their whole time in school. And my son is a teacher, a Black male teacher that they just gravitate to. They just love him to death. They cry when they have to leave him and all of that, because children need to see people who look like them in positions of authority, and people who will talk to them about how to maneuver in a world that is a fake equality. And there are so many lessons that you have to learn in order to do well that I don't feel like children are getting now. And even how to survive with good mental health, and how to handle this feeling of not having an opportunity or not having an equal opportunity. Don't take it out on each other. There are ways that you can get up out of this pit, but if nobody's there to teach them who's ever got up out that pit, then how do they learn to get up out of that pit? So I think that standardized testing and teaching to test took away time that some of it used to be available for conversation. Used to be time for debriefing when children had issues in their neighborhood or whatever. And all of that went away because everything had to be can't even bring in people to just come in and talk to the class. So I think we threw away the things that helped children cope better and have better mental wellness. And we replaced it with things that don't even necessarily determine your ability to do well on a job. Because see, students make some great employees.
Well, I think
As a former boss.
there's a lot to unpack about the education system in America, and many critics of the education system will absolutely say that too many of our public schools are not really invested in preparing students to be the best versions of themselves, and are just sort of churning out people for the workforce, right? They're not necessarily invested in their well-being on a holistic level. And of course, we've heard the school to prison pipeline concept, and how schools are not necessarily looking to build people who are going to be full citizens and can engage in a way that's rich and meaningful. So that's such a rich topic.
Over my time, huh? I'm looking at the time.
There's so much to talk about. I think we could spend oodles of time on any of these things that we've started conversations about. But I do want to recognize the time and give sort of folks an opportunity to take that little break. I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation so far. Feel free to share whatever's swirling in your minds at this point in the chat, if you're feeling inclined. But I do want to give you all a chance, a little breather to take a break and digest everything that Cleo shared with us and everything that we chatted about. So the time is about 7:56 my time. I think some folks are I think Louisiana's in a different time zone. So if you can just watch the clock and join back at around 8:01 or 7:01, depending on where you are, that would be great. The room will certainly stay open, so you're certainly welcome to stay here and chit chat. And then when we come back, we're going to do a slight pivot and connect with George, and then we will have Cleo back in that conversation to talk even more. So thank you for your time so far. Okay, it's officially 8:02, so I gave everyone an extra minute. So I hope you had a chance to take care of yourself, use the bathroom if you needed to, grab a drink of water, whatever it is that you needed to do. And I welcome you back to the conversation. If you haven't had a chance to check out the chat, there's a really wonderful conversation taking place in the chat, lots of rich reflections and thoughts. So please feel free to jump into that conversation and share sort of as we go along. I forgot to mention that at the start of the conversation, but hopefully you haven't held back because I didn't explicitly invite you to share. So please feel free to continue chatting and sharing with each other and reflecting in the conversation. Lots of rich stuff in there. So in this second half of the conversation, we're going to spend some time with, we're going to get to know George Foote a little bit and his family and his family's connection to this fight for voting rights in Lake Providence, Louisiana. So I'm going to turn the tables over to Norman for a short bit to introduce George and his story, and then we'll get a chance to have a conversation with George.
Hi again, everyone. This conversation is an idea that I had in my head, and to see this playing out, I'm just so excited. So we're the first part of the conversation is awesome, and we're getting to what I know is going to be a special moment when both George and Cleo are on together. So let me tell you a little bit about George. I'm going to start off with his professional background and then go to the personal, much like I did for Cleo. So George is a successful father and a successful husband, a successful lawyer who comes from a family with significant political clout in Lake Providence. He has spent his professional career building public-private partnerships for organizations such as the United States Institute of Peace, the Wireless Industry Trade Association, the Wireless History Foundation. He has represented public companies in the US, a major European defense manufacturer, and energy and natural resource companies. George has extensive board experience, and overall his professional experiences and his educational background, together with his family's position in Lake Providence, gives them a great position to understand the legal underpinnings and the power structures that shape today's society and that shape much of our history. But my relationship with George is one that started off without any of this knowledge, more on a personal level. George and I went to the same college, albeit 30 years apart. I met him serving on the advisory board for the Shepherd Poverty Program. The Shepherd Program came along long after George and his classmates had graduated from Washington and Lee. And on separate occasions, while on the board, I heard George express an interest in connecting his classmates to the work of the Shepherd Program. So I decided to explore his interest a bit more. And in that conversation, he introduced me to Cleo, Witness to the Truth, and his family's role in the history of Lake Providence. George expressed a deep respect for Cleo and healthy gratitude for the friendship that was developing. I thought that I would learn a lot from watching how Cleo and George navigated their shared history, and I wanted to share this learning with my community. And so here we are. For me, George reminds me that a curious mind and an open heart can always lead to us on the path towards justice, hope, and if we are just willing to listen with an open heart, with humility, and to follow where that spirit is leading us, then we can make some true progress. So with that, turn over to George and Tron.
Welcome, George. Let me spotlight us so that folks have us with them. And where did you, oh, there's George. Okay, here we go. Well, George, thank you for joining the conversation and being a part of tonight's program. I love chatting with you and Cleo, and sort of got a chance to see your friendship, and I'm eager to get to that part of the conversation as well. So sort of, as we start, can you just share sort of what your family's role was in the fight for voting rights in Lake Providence, and the impact that they had?
Tron, thank you. Let me start with a note of gratitude. I just want to say thank you to you, Tron, and to you, Norman, for your leadership and for putting together all the pieces of a program like this. And Julie, thanks to Fairlington Presbyterian for hosting it. It's a great opportunity for me to keep learning. And thanks to everybody who's joining in this, and I hope you take something from it in your own conversations. Tron's using some euphemistic words to talk about my family's role in voting rights in Lake Providence, because the family that she's talking about was on the exact opposite side of voting rights, and the two people in particular, whose names were Frank Velker Sr. and Frank Velker Jr., were a judge and lawyer, respectively, who made rulings and represented the registrar of voters that kept Reverend Scott, his family and flock from registering for many years. Not that it's all that important, but it's representative of the larger conversation about race in America to know that the Velkers, who, and Judge Velker was my grandfather's brother, that's the connection. The Velkers were part of a family that had been in Lake Providence for many, many years, going back to before slave days and during slave days, as slave owners, planters, part of the white power structure community that was there. And what happened in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s was not different, except in degree, from what happened in Reconstruction and in the days of redemption, so-called, when the whites took back over from the pitiful little gains that had been allowed to Black people, through the era of the Black codes, and into the 20th century and the days of Jim Crow. So while we can talk about those two men in particular, and what they did was indefensible and was wrong, and nobody's going to defend that, and no degree of explanation should be ever considered justifying or excusing whatever went on. I will try to understand that and keep it in context. But what they did and the milieu that they lived in was, in a way, what was very much what was built that I was born into in the last days of Jim Crow. And as we were talking the other day, and as I've had other conversations about this over the years, it's a real hard thing to understand for a white baby boomer who's had many of the privileges that we now recognize as privileges, to understand how we didn't know this stuff before. Why didn't we know when we were just born, when we were children, about just how wrong things were? While I was going to a nice all-white school, there were Black kids in my hometown who were handing down those books that Cleo was talking about that went to the Black kids in the other schools. We thought nothing of it. It's just, it's shameful. It's hard to imagine why that was, but the white families who had that power, I attribute it to economic reasons that were then translated into biblical and legal and social reasons, all sorts of justifications. But it's hard for me to understand why we don't know these things sooner. But you know, the people in the peace building community will tell you that peace is a process. And it just teaches me that the road to social justice doesn't have a finish line. Social justice is a process too. And we shouldn't not take steps because we didn't take them before. We shouldn't not do things now because we didn't do them yesterday. And we're just really lucky when we can stumble across people like Cleo who help show us the way forward. So there's a little bit of context, and I'm happy to elaborate at greater length if you'd like.
Mm-hmm. So what were, and so from what I understand from our previous conversation, you weren't really told much about your family's history growing up, and your mom sort of kept things under wraps, if you will. So what was going through your mind when you learned about your family's role in hindering the right to vote for Blacks in Lake Providence?
Well, I will tell you, when I first got the copy of Cleo's book, my sister-in-law Glenda, excuse me, sent it around, and I read it, and I got to the page about the Velkers, and I was just shocked. I wasn't shocked because they're racists in my family. That's not shocking to any white person in the South. I wasn't shocked that this went on in Lake Providence because I knew enough about Lake Providence, but it was a real eye-opener to see that name in that position doing those things. So I then began to send the book. I told my brothers, and I've got 5 brothers and a sister. I said, okay, guys, I'm sending this book around. I want you all to read it and let's talk about it. So that book has made its way around my family, everybody annotating it, putting their own notes, some of them not repeatable in polite company. And finally, my sister-in-law Glenda realized that this book had these margin notes and notes pasted in it. And she said, I want it back. So that book is now enshrined at Glenda's house in Nashville, Tennessee. We'll never see it again, but I'm very happy to tell Cleo that I've got a bunch more of these. So you can't get rid of me. But to answer the question directly, knowledge comes dropping slowly, like peace. You learn these things little by little. It's shocking at the time, and it's always shocking to you to realize that you should have known this sooner, that you didn't know this sooner. And I think that it's less important to figure out when you learn something and how you learned it, and still less important to learn or to think about what people did in the past, except by way of illustration, than it is to think, what do I do tomorrow? What do I do next week? What do I do about these things that are so wrong in the days that are left to me? And that's where I think a conversation about race is most useful for white people, because it teaches us that while we might think we're good people, and look, my parents were good people. I love my father as much as Cleo loved hers. He did wonderful things for many people. That's not the end of the story. That's not the end of the road. That's not where it should go. And there were things he could not do because of the way he was brought up. He just didn't have the vocabulary for it. He didn't have the words for it, didn't have the inclination for it. But now we know. Now I know. My brothers, and I see a couple of them on the call here, we know. And so the usefulness of these conversations and the grace, and I mean it, the grace of knowing people like Cleo and her family. And Jewel, I know you're on here too, and I'm glad to see you as well. The grace of those kind of conversations is that it turns you loose. It gives you the permission to move forward in a positive way and to keep going down the road of social justice and maybe bring some people along with you.
Can you give us a view into some of the conversations that you and your siblings had about your family's connection and reading the book? Sort of what were the conversations like? What were some of the challenging points sort of in those ongoing conversations that surface?
Sure, and there have been plenty of them. A lot of them are informed by, let's just call it shame, sheepishness. Hey guys, why didn't we know this before? Why didn't we ask these questions? And so it's an awakening. It's a realization that something really has been missing about it. Now, there are no opportunities to talk to the older generation about, why didn't you tell me this? We have one member of the family who's my mother's brother, who's very old now, who is as unreconstructed as anybody would be. So the conversations with that uncle are not very productive and wouldn't be very useful to do. The conversations among ourselves, we all see eye to eye on moving forward. The really interesting conversations are with our children, because our children cannot believe how retrograde their parents are. They can't believe the words that we use, and not impolite words. We just are not using language like they do. They don't think about things that we children of Jim Crow think about. And I think that we probably learn more from them than they from us, but those conversations are interesting conversations to have, along with the developing talk among the brothers and with our sister.
I'm curious, what kind of conversations did you have with your children? What did you tell them? How did you frame it for them?
Well, there are a lot of conversations. We're a talkative bunch, as you can tell. And there are conversations about how to participate better in the world, how to better respect people, how to move away from the sense of distinction among people that white people in the South, and I think, and Cleo talked about this some too, that Black people in the South didn't get from their parents. That is, not enough awareness of knowledge of other people. Cleo learned it in much harsher ways than I ever did. But the conversations with younger people today help us move away from any sense of otherness, of a different race, of a different people. In the 1950s, there was a very definite sense that Black people and Hispanic people and Asian people were different. That is the conversation around a white dinner table. Those people are different. And there wasn't a sense that even having that thought, making that comment, those conversations, wasn't any thought that was wrong, but it was a given. And it was biblically justified. It was justified by the way the laws that were written, of course, by old white men who were writing it for their benefit. But by law, we defined whether people were white or Black. And there's a great book, White by Law, that will go into the history of how the legal system was structured to define what a white person was, which was, of course, the ticket to all the things that white privilege would bring to you. So those conversations back in the 50s and the 60s around white dinner tables were centered around that otherness and all of the things that went from that. They weren't directed at how do we overcome the otherness? How do we do better on this score? It was much more rooted in the ancient days of protecting the economic privilege of people who had it. And in my family's case, they were the planters who had the land and owned the slaves and had the political offices later. Today, fortunately, those are not the center of the conversation, and we're much more on that road to social justice farther down the road, where the question is, how do we educate more people? How do we help Reverend Barber's Poor People's Campaign? How do we advance voting rights in America? How do we get more people in office who will move the road to social justice forward? That's a big change. It's a big change, and it's a bigger change for white people than for Black people. Reverend Scott could have told you all this stuff in 1955. He knew all this. White people knew it, but they denied it and held back. And now fewer people are holding back. Let's put it that way.
You mentioned that when you first became aware of your family's roots and intervention in terms of preventing Blacks from voting, one of the emotions I think that you said or word similar was shame and guilt and feeling badly about that. And in conversations around race and oftentimes for many whites who are asked to participate in the conversation, shame is often something that prevents them from engaging, or shame, they feel shame and then they sort of remove themselves from the conversation. How did you and your siblings, but mostly you, because you're here, how did you navigate that shame, and how would you sort of speak to other folks who are in that privileged position when they're sort of falling upon that emotion, and how would you tell them to sit with it and sort of stay connected to the conversation?
Tron, that's a question of psychology beyond my capability, but the sense of shame that I was talking about is as much a sense of I guess it manifests itself, whatever it may be, in a reluctance to talk about racial matters. And people smarter than me can draw reasons for why there is a reluctance of white people to talk to Black people about race. They'll talk to each other quite a bit, and those conversations are not very productive because there's no Cleo in the conversation. So you just don't, it's a pretty thin conversation. But more than shame holding back, I think there is on the part of many white people a missing permission. We need something to get us over the hump to talk about it. And I think there's often a sense that, well, gosh, if I bring up social justice matters, my friends will think less of me because they want to talk about something else. And it's uncomfortable. I'll make them uncomfortable, so I'm not going to do it. So I don't know that. I mean, certainly among my brothers, there's not nobody's paralyzed by shame. It's not a sentiment that runs very deeply, but there is an awareness that something needs to be done. And I keep coming back to it. It's meeting people like Cleo and Norman. I mean, had some great conversations at the Alexandria pastry shop with Norman about race. And a white person doesn't have those conversations with people who are not this light color very often. So it's getting a chance to talk to somebody who will talk in a non-judgmental way, in a friendly way, in a productive way, in an educating way, is a rare, valuable thing for white people to do. And one of the productive things we could do on this road to social justice that I keep thinking about is finding ways to promote these kind of conversations.
Mhm. I certainly can't speak for all folks of color, but I know for me, and this is a sentiment that is there, is for me, for example, I don't always think or assume that white folks want to have that conversation, right? So I'm curious, from your point of view and from your interactions with in your circles with other white peers, is that something that they're wanting to have? Are they seeking out these conversations?
Boy, I can no more talk about all white people than anybody can talk about all people of color.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say there are more white people willing to talk about race than any Black person could ever talk to. And the challenge is to find them, is to get to them. A little example. Back when George Floyd was murdered, in my little law firm, we had a paralegal who was upset like we all were. And Sarah said, we need to do something about this. And so she organized a book club that began a methodical search. She put together a list of books, search into racism, into the roots of racism, into what causes things. And I know that the people in that little club, from the conversations that we've had as we talked about the books, have been provoked, pushed by that series of discussions with each other. And they're people of all different races and colors in that, to have other conversations with a wider circle of people. You can't sit down on the subway and talk to somebody about white privilege. That's not going to get you too far. And these things don't happen artificially. There has to be some organic basis for it. But if someone asked me, how do you make that happen? I would say there are thousands of organizations that are involved in housing, voting reform, education, care for immigrants, plenty of those organizations. So if a white person says, okay, I'm ready to talk, they won't all have a Cleo to help them through it, but the organizations are there and the people in those organizations are available. And my encouragement to anybody in that case is to join the conversation. You'll be amazed join the organization. You'll be amazed at the conversations that spring up from it.
That's important to remember, and I'll definitely keep that in mind. I know it was interesting when you said that that folks don't always feel like they have permission to bring up the topic of race, and it made me think about my own interactions with friends of color and with peers of color, that it's just sort of it always comes up in some form or some fashion, but we always talk about race and identity and in some kind of way. But when I'm in more predominantly white spaces, it's not a common thing that comes up in terms of a point of conversation. So it made me think a little bit about that. So that is interesting to think about and sort of keep in the back of my mind. Wonderful. Well, any sort of last thoughts before we bring Cleo on and chat with the both of you? Anything that you want to sort of impart?
The less I talk and the more Cleo talks, the better off we'll all be.
Well, all righty then. Well, we will bring Cleo back in the spotlight. Okay, so let me add spotlight to Cleo. All right, I am figuring this Zoom thing out. Well, Cleo, so I was watching you while George and I were chatting a little bit. And I saw a little reaction from you when George shared sort of his evaluation that there are many, many more whites out there who are eager to have this conversation on race and to engage. I would love for you to share sort of what was going through your mind.
Probably not what you were thinking. I, I had been taking notes as he was talking because I do a lot of, I call it race work in the Charleston area. And he was just saying some things that I just felt like I needed to just jot down that I could use in my work. Talking about being able to speak in a non-judgmental way and finding spaces, where you can feel comfortable having conversations. So I was just jotting down some things.
Okay, great. Well, I'd love for you each to sort of share, how your friendship has impacted you over the years, sort of how has it shaped you? How has it changed your perspective or shaped your perspective, if you will? Sort of what has your friendship meant to each of y'all?
Well, I think, like the way that we actually got to know each other, like to meet each other, and like, who is this random white guy contacting me? But then he said he had gotten my book, and so, oh, okay, so this is the reader.
So was it an email? How did he reach out? By email, by phone? Did he knock on
Yeah,
your door?
it was by email. How did you get me? I don't know. I don't
know.
remember.
I don't know. I think I looked you up I found out about the book and I started reading about the book, and somehow there was a contact that I developed through finding out about the book.
I think you went to my website and hit me up on the contact page there. And then we started talking, and then he says, well, in his email, he had relatives in Louisiana and Lake Providence. And so then we ended up like talking on the phone. And of course, I said, who's your people in Lake Providence? And he just talked. And I said, but you never told me who's your people. And he talked. I'm like, who are your people? and of course, that's what country people say. They always ask, who are your people? And then he goes something like, well, let's just say my people are some people who are trying to keep your people from getting the right to vote. And I go, oh, he talk, but who are people? So that's kind of our first conversation. But then, we talked and talked about more things but I guess for me, I talk to a lot of people, and I talk to a lot of people about race. But to be honest, I don't talk to a lot of white males older than me about race. Slightly, but it was good having someone who wanted to talk, who was willing to talk, and who seemed like, no questions other than who your people was off limits in the conversation. So I enjoy talking to new people and learning about new people. So it was right down my alley to have someone who wanted to have these kinds of conversations. And this was, I guess, not long after Floyd had been murdered, right? Yeah. So yes. So it wasn't different.
You know, we
And
have,
I'm not in a negative way, George. I'm just saying it was a different opportunity.
I know, and we have laughed about that first awkward conversation because I had played over in my mind a dozen times, how am I going to tell her that Frank Velker is my cousin? How am I going to tell her about my family's slave owning history in Lake Providence? Well, dial the doggone phone and see what happens. And that's why I kept talking, because I didn't want to say it when we were. But eventually, and this is what, talking will do for you. And this is what, someone who has every right in the world to unload centuries of resentment on someone else who doesn't do that. We got to it and we got over it. And I thought later, well, that wasn't so bad. You survived that. And it's been a lot of fun ever since.
Wait. When he said Volca, I said, oh.
You did.
But go ahead.
Well, and the thing is, until I read that book, you knew so much more about that part of my family history than I did. And one of the things that we have talked about since then is this silence in Black and white families of just not talking about so many of these things that are friction between the races. No one ever told me about that. I mean, I knew about some of the family history back there, and of course knew the old stories a little bit, but I did not know that active voter suppression activity at all. And I think, to go back, trying to your point about shame, I think there was shame among the generation, my parents' generation, and the Frank Jr. generation. I think eventually they realized, gosh, we shouldn't be doing that. That's wrong. Those are citizens. Those are human beings. They deserve a vote as much as I do. And, if they vote to raise the taxes, well, we just have to pay more taxes. But those conversations didn't happen. That sort of information about those, let's call them shameful events in the family history, didn't happen. And so it makes it harder for my generation to talk about them and to explore them. And it's really, I keep coming back to the word, graceful of the people who were the recipients of that treatment to admit people like me to that conversation.
Well, what I liked about George was that after we talk or whatever, then he'd send me an email or something. Oh, look what I found out about da 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 da. Like my little tagline in my business is understanding, introspection, and change. And so I like to go around and say, well, I try not to do anything unless it creates understanding, introspection, and change. And so if I talk to somebody and then they get all curious and start researching, and then they call me back or email me back and say, I found out da 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 da, then it's like, yay, it's like, I like a person who gets curious and who starts to dig, deeper. And it's not just him learning, but, we talked about school and what it was like. And so I'm learning about the white world that was kept hidden from me growing up in the South. So it's like you're learning from each other. But I remember one thing he said just the other day that stuck with me. I didn't, and I may get it wrong, I didn't have a context from which to even start a conversation with Black people because I never been around Black people, never went to school with Black people, even in college. You know, we looked that up like, oh, when did his college get integrated? So in the 60s, late 60s. So yeah, so it's the difficulty of creating comfortable spaces where people feel comfortable. Just say whatever happened, whatever, just talk. And where the white person is going to feel comfortable that he or she is not going to be, you know, like attacked, you know, or they're not going to feel that you know, we get annoyed sometimes when we're trying to talk about race, and it seems like the people around us, you're not getting it. But, you know, if you find somebody patient, you can really go deep. And that's the work we've been doing, race work in Charleston since the murder of the parishioners at Emmanuel, Mother Emmanuel, which anniversary is tomorrow, I believe. And we've come a long way. Not so much with our faith community as with the business community. There is something that seems to be like a roadblock with faith people talking about this topic, especially certain faith groups. Even like they were the ones at the State House trying to shut down certain things being taught in history, in South Carolina history, because they didn't say it, but they made white children uncomfortable. And they were making a law that they couldn't teach anything that made children uncomfortable. But that was the faith community coming against the very positive work that we had and have continuing in Charleston. So that was disappointing.
For sure. So as we continue this conversation and sort of seeing the chat that we're sort of transitioning into the Q&A as folks have posted some questions in the chat. So please feel free to pose questions in the chat for George and Cleo. And you know, you brought up that point about the role of faith communities in making these conversations difficult. And Gary Hughes, one of my fellow church members, asked that question. So we can come back to that question.
I hadn't even seen that question. I had not even
You
seen that question, and now I look over here. Yeah, it's well, I don't know about. Yeah, I do know about the Virginia, Alexandria area, but I was going to say in Charleston, in the holy city, everything was done with the blessings. I'm talking about slavery. There were no rules, no laws made that did not have church and state all mixed together. And so even though we're years and years past that, it seems like, you know, once a church has been in the bed with a certain spirit, that's a familiar spirit, and it's just hard to even see when that spirit is acting up in your community. And but that's from my spiritual perspective.
George, do you have anything that you want to say about that question? That's sort of the role that faith and the Christian church has played in social justice or in being anti-social justice.
I'm probably not the best person to speak about it, but I do know from from the way past that the white people have mobilized the Bible and religious principles to justify the oppression of Black people. You know, Cain and Abel, and the Bible says this, and the number of preachers in the South in the 1850s who railed about God's will being that these Africans be brought over and civilized or not, or owned. Talk about shame. That's shame. I think I think the church probably was quicker to come out of that fog than a lot of the rest of society. And I think the faith communities are real sources of leadership on racial justice these days. But in the past, religion and churches were mobilized along with so many other weapons available to people to preserve differences in races and otherness and white supremacy.
Mhm, mhm. So there's a
Can I
very,
do a shameless plug?
yeah.
A shameless plug. I've been researching race and religion for the last 2 years. So
The forthcoming essay.
I'm working, you can't do, apparently can't do two things well at the same time, trying to do a documentary and a book at the same time. But yeah, it's a very complicated story, but at every iteration, the white church fights itself whenever it comes to social justice issues. So, you know, Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, those were the major religions coming up to slavery. They all broke up over slavery. All of them got back together except the Southern Baptists. But you will find the Southern Baptists taking the lead, you know, during Reconstruction to make sure that Black people get put back in the same position. Then you find in the 50s, during the Civil Rights Movement, it's all the condemnations from the Presbyterian publications, the Baptist publications, that it's evil, integration is evil, the mixing of the races is evil, and so it's always been the church community that pushed racial division and racial discrimination, and it's always been the church community that fought racial. So my whole project is called The House Divided.
So I just want everybody on this call to make sure you stay in touch with Cleo and help her get this book finished, because we want to read it and need to encourage her without shaming her.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there was a very rich question posed in the chat, and I would love for you all to chat about it. And I'm curious if it's come up in your previous conversations. But what are your feelings about reparations? What are your thoughts about reparations?
Should I go first?
Yes, please.
Of course we need reparations. Of course we do. So much of the work that's going on in the whole racial justice world now is useless if we don't find some way to build wealth, to build economic security for Black Americans. So of course we need to do it. Does that mean writing a check to people? I don't know. Does it mean building up institutions and including people of all minorities? Yes, it does. And I see strengthening HBCUs as part of reparations. I see child care credit as reparations. I see so many things that we do for support and building the health. I mean, like physical health and mental health of people who have been hurt for so long as reparations. If you reduce it to the political hot button of how big a check do white people write to black people, you're not going anywhere. That conversation is a tough conversation, and I think it provokes defensiveness and antagonism on both sides. But I'm going to tell you, I'm on the side of saying, yes, we need to find a way to move money. If you look at the statistics of who owns what in this country, I mean, all of us on this call are way below the huge amount of money and the small number of people who have it at the very top of the economic scale. But if you divide it by race, well, black people are just at 1/10 of what white people are. We've got to find a way to change that. The inequality of income in the country is out of line altogether. And it's really driven in many respects by the fact that black people never catch a break and never get any money. So we got to find a way. We got to find a way to invest dollars. I mean, U.S. dollars in black families and black communities. If it means writing a check, I say we got to do it.
What are your thoughts, Cleo?
I don't know. I have never actually tied down my feelings on reparations, even though my oldest sister was a big leader in the reparations movement when it started and several decades ago. But I guess I think about things like if systems are not fixed, even if we get more opportunities, you will still, generations to come will still end up losing the gains if the systems are not fixed. And so if like they say, people don't have to be racist because the system will create the outcomes, no matter who the person is in the system. So until there is some analysis and some evaluation of systems that prevent equality, then I don't see the other part working so well. Of course, my younger son would probably say, well, at least give me a try. But, I'm a systems kind of person. And I think like with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, everything can be done to us now. And when you think about who filed the lawsuit in order to gut the Voting Rights Act, and you know that the mission statement of that organization is to remove all legal protections from all people of color, then you know that there is something much more concerning right now. Like the same organization that gutted the Voting Rights Act, they're the same one that filed the suit on behalf of the Asians at Harvard because they tried it by filing a suit with a white young lady against the University of Texas, and they lost. So they decided to get an Asian to say that they were being discriminated against by Blacks and Hispanics who were not as smart as they were. And now that's going to the Supreme Court. That's to get rid of set-asides in education, to get rid of affirmative action through the Supreme Court. And so as all protections are slowly, and they deliberately file their cases in jurisdictions where they know they will lose so that they can move up through the courts. And so that is what we're having to look at as a people, this concerted, organized effort, and using the whole thing about a stolen election to implement all these new rules and criminalize the voting process. Do you know how many things you can get a felony for just in the last 2 years? In Arizona, is it Oklahoma? Obstructing the vision of the poll watcher a felony? Like, it's some real dangerous things going on and being put into place. And so I think that more about those issues, because everything Daddy was about legal protections. And I'm a legal protections kind of girl, because nothing else matters once legal protections are lost.
You know, I'll say this in the legal protections. I'm with you, of course, on that. And we need plenty of legal protections. And Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the way that's been abused is criminal in itself. The law is both too often a tool for bad. And as a lawyer, I've spent my life talking about the rule of law, and the Institute of Peace promotes rule of law training and growth around the world. But laws written for malignant purposes that are then used as rules are a dangerous thing. And we've seen too much of that. I mean, Jim Crow was legal. Segregation was legal. So I've tempered my unalloyed admiration for the rule of law in many ways. However, the laws that we do have, the laws of progress, not to say progressive laws, like the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Act in the 60s and later, we definitely need to continue to protect those, and we need to restore a lot of that. So deploying the law is important. But the second thing is that the law is not enough. I mean, we've done a lot of things to outlaw really bad behavior, and the law has been used in many ways to eliminate. Well, take redlining, for example, where it used to be illegal to sell a house to an African American in certain areas. That gets wiped out, but economics and social mores and zoning can have the same effect. So just changing a bad law is not the end of the story. And we got to tend it, and it's up to us lawyers to do this in every possible way we can. We always have to keep our eye on the fact that we need so much more, that so much about society is norms and just dollars, that having good laws on our side just ain't enough. We need to have more.
For sure, for sure. Thank you. So I'm looking at the time, and I want to sort of be cognizant of the time, because we have already gone over the time for our official time together, and sort of want to give people permission to depart if they would like to. So I do want to officially wrap up the official part of our time together. But George and Cleo and I and Norman are definitely sticking around. So if you want to linger and continue the conversation, please know that you can do that. That's sort of, if you think about like a book reading in person, once the conversation wraps up, the program wraps up, people are milling around and so forth. So that time is sort of for us to do that. But before we close, and I hope that you all enjoy the conversation, and I'm certainly leaving with a lot to think about and with a lot to research. So I'm hoping that you all are leaving this conversation curious and inspired as well, to continue to do this work that is difficult, it's challenging, it requires a lot of time, a lot of patience, and to continue to have these conversations with yourselves, with each other, with your friends. In the book, the last chapter of Witness the Truth, in that chapter, Reverend Scott offers some parting advice and parting thoughts to his children. And this is during the last sort of few months of his life as he's battling prostate cancer. And one of the things that resonated for me was a piece around the importance of open and honest and truthful dialogue around issues such as racial relations, and other acts and sort of other issues of injustice. So I'd love for Cleo to read that excerpt sort of as an invitation for us to think about how we move forward, how we sort of carry the conversation from tonight into our lives tomorrow and moving forward, and sort of every day afterwards. So Cleo, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, well, we'll close out with this piece from Witness to the Truth. And it's starting to lighten really hard and storm here. So hopefully I won't have a power outage. But it says truth and open. Well, Dad in the last chapter was talking about things that he wanted to leave with you. So he said truth and open communication should come next. In the late 1960s, after the burnings and killings stopped and the buses, restaurants, stores, and schools were integrated, I used to think that after a while, Blacks and whites would forget about the color of the skin and they were all going to unite and work together. It was only later that I began to see signs that the new peace and harmony between the races wouldn't last. It took some study, but I finally figured out what the problem was. We had tried to build a future without first dealing with the past. So that is why I put communication and truth near the top of the list. A law was passed in the 1960s to make discrimination illegal. In the 1960s, to make discrimination illegal, but there was little dialogue and few changes to history books or education of the masses meant to change the hearts of man. And because hearts were not changed, you can see today reflections in our children of the anger, resentment, racial bias, and hatred, and worst of all, the blindness to discrimination that so controlled the parents of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So I say to anybody of any race who says leave the past in the past, that no problem was ever solved by ignoring it. The issues separating the races and leading to discrimination and dislike will be passed down from generation to generation until Black people and white people start to talk honestly about the long-term impact of slavery, and even more important, the impact of Jim Crow laws. So I ask everyone to talk and search and seek to acquire knowledge. We seek this knowledge not to feel guilty, not to get angry and lay blame, but to understand how things got the way they are, that we will not be ignorant in decision making, and so that we will all want to change for the better. The quest for knowledge may not be simple, as much history is unrecorded or recorded in the Black sections of bookstores and libraries where many may never go. Then the information is disturbing to both Blacks and whites, especially to Southern whites who may be familiar with only one side of their heritage. The natural instinct is to reject truth as an exaggeration. Last, it takes quite a bit of talking about racial issues before one can dig deep enough to reach the truth. Although it might seem like a lot of effort, truth is what the country needs. Truth is the only thing that can break the chains that slavery and Jim Crow still hold around America. Only truth will set our minds free. As a minister, I challenge other ministers of all faiths to take the lead in resolving matters of race in America. So that's the challenge that has been placed to the Fairlington Presbyterian Church of Alexandria, Virginia.
And to all of us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to all of us. Thank you. So thank you all for joining us, for taking the time, for continuing to do this work, for leaning into the discomfort. And we leave the space hopefully hearing those words and being guided by Reverend Scott's words. So that our program is officially closing, but you are you're obviously welcome to stay for a little bit longer for some more informal conversations with Cleo and George to ask whatever questions you might have. But I do sort of want to give explicit permission for you all to depart and carry on with whatever you might have going on tonight with your evening. So
I'm
thank-
going to put my contact information in there in case anyone wanted to reach out.